Vesper 3 was dying. Above the once thriving colony, the sky burned, a terrible mix of orange and black as smoke and plasma fire intertwined. The air itself trembled under the relentless assault. The Draith Syndicate, a war-hardened species known for their merciless conquests, had arrived in full force. Their fleet loomed over the planet like an executioner's blade, a vast collection of serrated warships, each resembling an obsidian beast with claws of plasma and fangs of kinetic artillery. From orbit, they rained destruction upon the colony's defenses, turning once proud fortifications into craters of molten slag. The shield generators had failed within the first hour, overwhelmed by a precision bombardment that left their core reactors as nothing more than burning husks. Automated defense turrets fired until they overheated, some melting into useless metal skeletons before the Draith's advance even reached them. The streets of the colony were worse. Civilians who had tried to flee were now nothing more than shadows burned into walls, their remains lost to the heat of disintegrator weapons. The local militia, brave but outmatched, had staged ambushes in alleyways, only to be cut down by merciless Draith enforcers, their razor-edged armor soaked in human blood. The attackers moved with cold, inhuman precision, their weapons humming with every calculated execution. Deep beneath the surface, in the heart of the command bunker, Governor Elias Vance stood rigid before a tactical display, his face lined with exhaustion. His breathing was shallow, his body tense. He had always known, deep down, that this day might come. Behind him, the bunker's emergency lights cast long shadows against the walls, pulsing red like a dying heartbeat. The underground facility, reinforced against orbital strikes, had bought them minutes, not hours. The Draith were coming, and when they found them, there would be no negotiation, no surrender. They were here to harvest. A warning chime sounded from the main console. Dr. Lillian Kale, the colony's chief scientist, flinched at the sound but quickly moved to analyze the data. Her short, dark hair was matted with sweat, her hands shaking as she navigated the failing systems. "Our distress signals are still broadcasting," but she trailed off, staring at the screen as if she wished she could change what it said. No response. No fleet. No reinforcements. A silence heavier than the planet's gravity filled the room. Elias exhaled, rubbing a hand across his face. Then we're alone. The thought hit harder than he expected. The unified Terran Directorate, humanity's mighty empire among the stars, had abandoned them. "There's got to be another way," he muttered, forcing himself to think. "Some contingency, some fallback we haven't used yet." Dr. Kale hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the far end of the bunker. A tall alien structure stood there, half buried in the metallic floor. It was covered in etched symbols, an eerie golden glow flickering from within the grooves. Older than the colony, older than anything humanity had built on this world, it had been uncovered decades ago beneath the first layer of soil, a relic of a long-forgotten civilization. She swallowed. "There is one thing," she said carefully. Elias followed her gaze. "You're not seriously suggesting that thing," he said, his voice lower now, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something best left undisturbed. Dr. Kale turned to fully face him. "We know it's some kind of transmitter. We ran tests years ago, but the power draw was beyond anything we could provide. Now, with the Draith's bombardment tearing through the planet's crust, their weapons might have already activated some of its latent energy pathways." Elias frowned, stepping toward the alien beacon. He had always been wary of it. Unlike everything else in this colony, it wasn't human-made. It belonged to a race that was now nothing but dust. "And what exactly do you think it does?" Elias asked. "We always assumed it was a distress signal," Kale admitted. "That whatever species built it activated it when they were on the verge of extinction." Elias inhaled sharply. "And yet, they're not here, which means either no one answered, or something did, and they didn't survive it." The tension in the room thickened. A fresh explosion from above sent shockwaves through the bunker, causing dust to fall from the ceiling. The distant, muffled screams of the last human defenders echoed through the emergency vents. Dr. Kale flinched but held firm. "Governor, in the next 5 minutes, we are going to die." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Whatever this thing is, it has survived untold millennia. It outlasted every war, every natural disaster, every civilization that came before us. I don't know what it will do if we activate it, but it's our only option." Elias turned to the holographic tactical display. The Dreith's ground forces had breached the final perimeter. The last red icons of human defenders were vanishing one by one. This was it. With a deep breath, he turned back to Kale. "Do it." She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before pressing her hand against the ancient structure's control panel. The grooves beneath her fingers lit up, as if sensing the touch of a living being for the first time in thousands of years. A deep, resonating hum filled the bunker, and the lights flickered wildly, struggling against a power beyond anything the colony had ever harnessed. The beacon awoke. Its ancient energy rippled outward, surging through the ground like a pulse of invisible fire. Machines hummed to life, mechanisms shifting and realigning as something vast and incomprehensible stirred beneath the surface of reality. High above, in the void of space, the Dreith detected the signal. Aboard their flagship, the Syndicate warlord Craxus Velton narrowed his reptilian eyes as his sensors relayed the incoming data. The transmission was old, impossibly old, encoded in a frequency that predated even the Dreith's own records. This was not a simple distress call. This was something else. For the first time in centuries, Craxus felt unease. Then the signal reached beyond the Dreith's scanners, slipping into the void. And something out there, something ancient, something that had been waiting, finally heard it. The stars shifted. Far beyond the Gnome galaxy, something enormous stirred in the abyss. The signal had been received, and now it was answering. The moment the beacon activated, the fabric of reality shuddered. Elias and Kale staggered back as arcs of golden energy crackled across the ancient structure, surging like living veins of power. The hum from the beacon deepened into something else, something far more primordial. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. A pulse rippled outward, expanding beyond the bunker, beyond the colony, beyond the very world itself. The transmission cut through the vastness of space, piercing the cosmic dark like a blade. And something answered. Aboard the Dreith flagship Tyrannus, warlord Craxus Velton stared at the incoming data stream, his reptilian slit eyes narrowing in disbelief. His fleet's communications had been hijacked. A single message, a sequence of impossibly old and complex symbols, now flooded every Dreith warship's interface. The translation systems failed. The language was not in any known galactic database. But they all understood one thing. The signal was not human. Craxus turned toward his second-in-command, a Dreith warrior clad in ornate battle armor. "Shut it down." The officer hesitated. "Sir, we..." Now. Across the bridge, technicians scrambled to isolate the transmission. Security firewalls engaged, emergency protocols activated, but it was too late. The flagship's systems began to fail one by one. The artificial gravity flickered, sending unsecured objects floating for a brief moment before violently slamming them back down. Power relays overloaded as feedback surged through their circuits, causing control panels to spark and explode. A low, grinding sound, not mechanical, but something deeper, almost alive, filled the bridge. Then, a single word formed on every display, on every Dreith ship, in a language so old that it had no written script, only meaning. The warlord froze. Something far beyond the Dreith Syndicate's comprehension had responded. And it was coming. The tear in reality. Vesper 3's sky split open. High above the colony, beyond the atmosphere, something impossible was happening. Space buckled. A wound in the fabric of existence began to form, a black rift crackling with jagged violet light. It was neither a wormhole nor a hyperspace gateway. Those were artificial constructs, understood and controlled by sentient beings. This was different. This was the arrival of something old, something that had been waiting for far longer than anyone could fathom. Elias and Kale, still in the bunker, watched the colony's last surviving surveillance feeds. The Draith fleet had stopped their bombardment entirely, their ships drifting out of formation, no longer focused on their attack. They had noticed it too. Then the first Draith warship imploded. Not from an explosion, not from an impact. It simply ceased to exist. One moment, the serrated black hull of the battleship hovered menacingly over the colony. The next, its structure collapsed inward, as if reality itself had suddenly rejected its presence. No fire, no wreckage, just erasure. Panic erupted across the remaining Draith fleet. Their warships began to maneuver wildly, some attempting to break orbit while others fired randomly into the unknown. Their weapons hit nothing. Whatever had arrived was not physical, at least, not in the way they understood. The rift expanded, and from within its void, they emerged. The arrival of the unseen. Kale felt it before she saw it. An overwhelming, mind-consuming pressure bore down upon her, like an unseen force pressing against her skull. The air itself vibrated, not with sound, but with something deeper, something that bypassed the senses and went straight to the soul. Then she saw them. Through the flickering surveillance feeds, she glimpsed shapes emerging from the rift. Not ships, not beings. Concepts made manifest. They had no form, yet they cast shadows against reality itself. Their edges were undefined, shifting between geometries that should not exist in three-dimensional space. They did not move so much as they unfolded, sliding through dimensions unseen. And wherever they touched, things ceased to be. Cal's breath hitched. What did we bring here? Elias couldn't answer. His hands trembled as he gripped the console. This isn't a rescue. The Draith learned that next. One of their battlecruisers fired a full broadside of plasma torpedoes toward the largest entity, its weapon systems desperate, frantic. The torpedoes traveled barely a kilometer before vanishing, snuffed out like embers caught in a vacuum. Then the entity acknowledged the ship. A second later, every Draith on board screamed. It wasn't a sound made through comm channels. It wasn't something that came from their throats. Their entire existence screamed. The battlecruiser blinked out of reality, leaving nothing behind, no debris, no explosion, just emptiness. And still, the entities descended, a galaxy watching in horror. Across the galactic expanse, long-range observatories detected the anomaly. The Unified Terran Directorate, which had ignored Vesper 3's distress calls, now received something else, an automated feed from the colony's last surviving satellites. Every signal relay, every sensor in range broadcast the event in real time. Governments, empires, warlords, every major power that had once considered themselves dominant forces of the universe, now watched in growing terror. The Draith Syndicate's once mighty fleet was disintegrating before their eyes. Not in battle, not in war, but by something fundamental and inevitable, like a natural law that had simply been reactivated. Elias and Kale stared in horror, realization creeping in. This isn't a war, Kale whispered. This isn't an invasion. She turned to Elias, her face pale, her voice barely audible. They were here before, a long time ago. And we just... Elias closed his eyes, finishing the thought she couldn't. We just reminded them that this galaxy exists. The sky above Vesper 3 churned with unnatural energy, a distortion that made even the most advanced sensors fail to register what was happening. The entities from beyond the rift did not radiate heat, did not reflect light in a way that made sense, and yet they were undeniably there. The Draith warships still in orbit had already lost half their number to the impossible force. Some ships simply vanished, erased from existence, as if they had never been. Others twisted, their metallic hulls folding in on themselves in ways that should have been physically impossible. There was no debris, no wreckage, just a growing silence where a fleet had once been. Inside the bunker, Elias and Kale sat frozen in front of the console. The colony's last remaining surveillance feeds flickered in and out, struggling to process what they were seeing. The entities had no singular form. They were contradictions given shape. When one looked at them directly, they appeared as vast, shifting figures, composed of angles that should not exist in three-dimensional space. Yet when viewed through the failing monitors, they became something else entirely, shadows moving against a backdrop of nothingness. Kale clenched her fists, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We brought them here," she muttered, voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't supposed to hear us. But we called out. And now there." She couldn't finish the sentence. Elias' hands were still on the console, though his fingers trembled as they hovered over the controls. "It wasn't just us," he said, his voice hollow. "This beacon wasn't designed for short-range distress calls. The signal, it pierced the void itself. Whatever it reached, it was waiting." Outside, the rift expanded, its edges writhing with violent arcs of unrecognizable energy. The colony's structures groaned under the gravitational distortions, the sheer presence of these things bending the physical world like paper in a storm. And still, the Draith fought. One of the remaining battleships, a towering fortress of war forged from 100 conquered worlds, broke formation and accelerated directly toward the entities. Its captain, driven either by desperation or madness, unleashed every weapon at their disposal: superheated plasma lances, hyperkinetic rail slugs, particle disruptors capable of unmaking matter itself. None of it mattered. Every shot dissolved before reaching its target, vanishing as if it had never been fired. The ship itself lasted only a moment longer before it, too, was noticed. The entity shifted, its formless mass unfolding in a way that made no sense to the eye. And then, the battleship was gone. Not destroyed, not obliterated. Simply removed. There was no explosion, no lingering energy signature, no drifting remains. The warship had been unwritten from reality itself. Aboard the Draith flagship, Warlord Kraxus watched the impossible unfold with mounting horror. His command staff stood in stunned silence, their scaled faces frozen in expressions of primal fear. The Draith were conquerors, predators at the top of the galactic chain. They had spent centuries reducing weaker civilizations to cinders. But this was something different. This was not a battle. This was a correction. Kraxus finally tore his gaze from the screens and barked a command, his voice sharp with something he refused to acknowledge as fear. "All remaining ships, retreat. Full hyperspace jump, now." His officers hesitated. "Sir, our long-range drives." "I don't care," Kraxus roared, slamming a clawed fist into the nearest console. "Find a way. We are leaving this system, now." But there was nowhere to go. All across the fleet, systems failed. Not from any weapon, not from sabotage, but because something far greater had simply willed it so. The rift widened again. And this time, the distortion was everywhere. Engines sputtered. Power grids collapsed. Gravity fields flickered in and out of existence. It was as if the very concept of technology was being rewritten by an intelligence so vast that it could no longer be opposed. And then they spoke, not in words, not in sound, but through raw meaning, projected directly into the minds of every being within reach. "U-R-A-I-R-E-L-E-V-N." The moment the thought entered their minds, Draith warriors collapsed where they stood, their bodies convulsing violently. Their eyes rolled back. Blood leaked from their nostrils, their ears, every orifice, every pore. Some clawed at their own skulls, as if trying to tear the words out of their brains. Others simply stopped moving altogether, their bodies shutting down in an instant. Kraxus, though stronger than most of his kind, felt something inside him shatter. He gasped, stumbling back as the weight of the message pressed against his very existence. This was no negotiation. This was a judgment, and it did not favor the Draith. On Vesper 3's surface, Elias and Kale felt it too. A pressure on their minds, a presence that had no mercy, no warmth, no hatred. It was indifference on a scale they could not comprehend. The colony's remaining infrastructure buckled under forces beyond physics. The bunker itself shook violently, the steel plating above them groaning under the strain. Kale gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus. "They're not just attacking," she whispered, staring at the displays with wide, terrified eyes. "They're rewriting reality. Everything they touch is being undone." Elias' hands curled into fists. He had spent his life fighting for survival, clawing his way through battles that had logic, enemies that could be outmaneuvered, foes that bled. But there was no battle. There was only inevitability. Kale turned to him, her voice low and desperate. "We have to shut the beacon down." He hesitated. "If we do, will they stop?" She shook her head. "I don't know." But it was their only chance. They had called out to something beyond the stars, and now it was answering. The bunker trembled as if the very fabric of reality outside was being peeled away. Elias fought to keep his balance, his fingers gripping the edge of the console so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The surveillance feeds continued to flicker in and out, each frame more horrifying than the last. The Draith fleet was collapsing, not in flames, not in debris-strewn wreckage, but in absence. One by one, the remaining warships simply ceased to be. Krax's flagship, once a towering behemoth of war, was now little more than a silhouette against the distortion above Vesper 3. The great predator of the Draith Empire stood alone, his mind barely holding itself together against the weight of the message still thrumming inside his skull. His officers, those who had not already died from sheer mental overload, lay motionless around him, their bodies rigid, their glassy eyes staring into something unseen. Kraxus bared his fangs, sucking in ragged breaths. He was no stranger to fear, but this was different. This was hopelessness. The weapons, the ships, the strength of his people, none of it had even registered as an obstacle to these entities. They were not invaders. They were not even enemies. To fight them would be to resist the tide itself, to stand in the face of an extinction-level event and demand that it stop. And it would not stop, because it did not care. A final desperate surge of survival instinct ignited in Krax's mind. He was not some weak creature. He was Draith. His ancestors had built an empire from the bones of lesser species. If his kind were to fall today, they would do so as warriors. With a guttural snarl, he staggered toward his command panel and slammed his clawed hand down on the override. The high-pitched whine echoed through the ship as the vessel's remaining energy reserves were routed to one final act of defiance. The ship's core rumbled, beginning the unstable buildup that would lead to an uncontrolled detonation, a last desperate attempt to do something to the entities beyond the rift. Kraxus refused to believe this was the end. Even if his species was to be wiped from the stars, let them remember the Draith as fighters, not victims. The detonation sequence reached its critical threshold. The flagship's reactor pulsed with unstable energy. A shockwave rippled through the shattered battlefield. And then, nothing. Not an explosion. Not a blinding, white-hot release of destruction. Just erasure. Krax's ship, along with its final act of defiance, was unmade in a single instant. Elias and Kale watched from the bunker in horrified silence. A moment ago, there had been something there, a warship of immense size, preparing to die in fire. Now, there was only void. Kale let out a shaky breath, her fingers trembling. They're not just destroying them. They're removing them. Elias could barely process it. It wasn't just the ship, it was everything. There was no energy discharge, no debris, no radiation signatures. It was as if the Draith's presence in this system had been scrubbed from history itself. A deep, gut-wrenching realization took hold of Elias. This was not an invasion. This was a correction. And humans had called it here. His mind snapped back to the present as another violent tremor rocked the bunker. Cale grabbed him by the arm. "We have to shut down the beacon. If there's even the slightest chance that ending the signal will make them leave, we have to take it." Elias forced himself to focus. He reached out, fingers flying over the console's interface, bypassing security locks and overriding the automated transmission protocols. The beacon was still active, pulsing at regular intervals, its signal piercing the infinite abyss beyond the galaxy. Elias' breath hitched. The data logs. They had changed. The original distress call had been nothing more than a high-powered emergency transmission, encoded with humanity's standard distress protocol. But now, the signal was unrecognizable. It had evolved. Mutated. It was still transmitting, but it was no longer theirs. Somewhere in the void, something else had hijacked the message. It was no longer a cry for help. It was an invitation. Elias' fingers hovered over the command that would shut the beacon down. "I don't understand," he whispered. "It's still sending, but it's not us anymore." Something's answering back. Cal's expression twisted in confusion. "What do you mean? Answering back how?" Elias hesitated. His gut told him that this was bigger than them now. The Draith had been the most powerful warriors in the sector, and they had been reduced to nothing in minutes. But what if these entities had never intended to answer the Draith at all? What if they had been listening for something else? Cal's voice hardened. "Elias, we have to shut it down." He swallowed hard and made his choice. He hit the kill switch. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, silence filled the bunker. The beacon's steady pulse ceased. The transmission that had lured these things into the galaxy was finally, mercifully, cut off. And outside, the void shifted. The air crackled with unseen forces. The distortions around the entities rippled, contracting slightly. Elias felt a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had stopped the worst from happening. Maybe, now that the signal was gone, the entities would leave. Then, a whisper. It did not come through the speakers. It did not emerge from the rift. It arrived inside their minds. A single phrase. A message. A response. "We have already seen." Elias and Cal's blood ran cold. The beacon had been silenced, but it did not matter. The entities were not leaving. Because now, they knew. And they were coming. The bunker was silent. Too silent. Elias' heartbeat thundered in his ears, each beat sharp and deafening. Cal's breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. The room, once filled with the steady hum of machinery and the rhythmic pulse of the distress beacon, was now a vacuum of sound. It was as if reality itself had paused, waiting for something to happen. But something had happened. The entities had spoken. Not through sound, not through transmission. They had spoken inside their minds. "We have already seen." The words still echoed, not as mere sound, but as a weight pressing against Elias' thoughts, a presence he could not shake. They carried no tone, no voice, no indication of emotion, just an absolute certainty. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Cal's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist in a death grip. "Elias," her voice was barely a whisper, trembling. He turned to her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking up. Slowly, almost against his will, Elias followed her gaze toward the ceiling. The reinforced metal panels, thick enough to withstand orbital bombardments, were warping. Not cracking, not denting, warping. As if something was pressing against them from outside reality itself, trying to fold its way inside. A low vibration passed through the floor, rattling loose equipment. Elias' mind screamed for logic, for an explanation that made sense. The beacon was off. The message had been silenced. The entities should have. "We have already seen." No. No, shutting down the signal had never mattered. Because the moment humanity had sent it, the moment their cry for help pierced the abyss, the moment the first note traveled beyond the edges of known space, they had noticed. They had found the signal. They had followed it. And now, they were here. A sharp snap rang through the bunker. The temperature dropped instantly, as if the warmth of life itself was being drained from the air. Elias saw his breath mist before him. Cale shivered violently. Then, the monitors flickered back on. But they weren't displaying ship readings. They weren't scanning the battlefield. They were showing something else, something impossible. The main screen displayed a star field, vast and endless, a cold, distant part of the universe where no ships had ever traveled. And in the center of the void, something moved. Something so vast, so incomprehensible, that Elias' mind refused to process it. The stars were not being blocked by it. They were being rearranged, shifted, bent, and rewritten as the entity moved. A mass without form, a presence without boundary. It had no true shape, because it did not need one. It simply was. Cale gagged, clutching her head. No, 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 I can't. She fell to her knees, gasping for air. Elias barely held himself together, his stomach twisting into knots. Looking at it was wrong. Not just disturbing, not just terrifying. Wrong. Like seeing something that should not exist. Like witnessing a contradiction in reality itself. The Draith fleet had been destroyed before the entity even arrived. And now, Elias understood why. Because this was not a fleet. This was not an armada, nor a war machine, nor an invading force. It was a correction. It was the answer to their distress signal. Not help. Not salvation. The response. Cale sobbed. We were never meant to send that message. Elias didn't respond. He couldn't. Because on the monitors, the impossible shifted again. And this time, it was not just watching. It was reaching. Something descended from the rift above Vesper 3, a fragment of the unknowable. A tendril. A limb. A mere thought-given form. Elias couldn't tell. It was blacker than black, darker than the void itself. And it was coming down. Straight toward the planet. Straight toward them. The bunker's walls trembled, panels vibrating as unseen forces pressed against them. The security doors buckled outward as if space itself was bending inward. We have to go, Elias gasped, grabbing Cale by the arm. She barely responded, still staring at the screen, her body frozen in terror. Cale, we have to move. Somehow, she broke free of the paralysis gripping her mind, nodding frantically. Elias hauled her to her feet, both of them stumbling toward the emergency exit. The bunker was built to withstand conventional destruction, orbital strikes, biological hazards, even some of the deadliest weapons known to the galaxy. But it was not built for this. They'd reached the exit panel. Elias slammed his hand against the release override. Nothing. A red warning flashed on the screen. SEQURITLOCKDODONENGEGT EXTERNAL BREAGE DETCTE. Elias swore. He hit the panel again. Nothing. Something outside had already begun, rewriting the very rules of reality around them. Cale panted, eyes darting wildly. What do we do? What do we? Boom! The bunker lurched. The air warped. And then, silence. Not just an absence of sound, an absence of everything. Elias' mind screamed, his body weightless, his senses unraveling. He couldn't feel the floor. He couldn't feel Cale's grip. He couldn't even tell if he was still alive. The last thing he saw before the world vanished was the monitor. And on it, the entity turned. Not toward Vesper 3. Not toward the Draith. Not toward the battlefield. It turned toward Earth. The moment stretched into eternity. Elias had no sense of direction, no sensation of up or down, left or right. It was as if he had been untethered from reality itself, flung into a void where time and space had ceased to function. There was no air, no weight, no sound, just an endless abyss. And yet, something was there with him. Not physically, not in a way that made sense. It was a presence, a vast, unknowable consciousness pressing against the edges of his mind, a force so monumental that it defied comprehension. He could not see it, yet he felt it saw him. No, not just saw him. It understood him. It was reading him, peeling back the layers of his mind like pages in a book, rifling through his memories, his thoughts, his fears, examining him as something utterly insignificant. It was not hostile. It was not merciful. It was simply indifferent. And then, a rupture in existence itself. With a sudden, violent pull, Elias was yanked back into reality. Gasp. His lungs burned as air rushed back into them. His body convulsing as sensation returned all at once. The shock of it was nearly as terrifying as the void itself. His back slammed against a cold, hard surface, pain searing through his muscles. He was back. But where? Blinking rapidly, Elias forced himself upright. He was in the bunker. The same bunker. And yet, everything was wrong. The walls were fractured, not physically, but in a way his mind refused to interpret. The reinforced metal, once solid and unyielding, was now warping, pulsing with an eerie, slow ripple, like the surface of a disturbed pond. The ceiling twisted in and out of focus, shapes bleeding into one another. It was as if the very fabric of reality had suffered a wound. A groan beside him. Kale. She was on the floor, clutching her head, breathing in ragged, panicked gasps. Her pupils were dilated, her body shivering as if she had been plunged into Arctic waters. Elias crawled toward her, shaking her shoulder. Kale. Kale, wake up. She let out a weak, pained whimper, squeezing her eyes shut. It's inside my head. Elias froze. His skin went ice cold. What did you say? He whispered. Kale shuddered violently, her fingers curling into fists against her temples. She gagged. I can still hear it. Elias' stomach twisted. The entity. It hadn't just observed them. It had touched them. Left something behind. A flickering light caught Elias' attention. The monitors were still active, but their displays were wrong. They no longer showed the battlefield. No longer displayed the Draith fleet, the wreckage, or even Vesper 3. Instead, they showed Earth. Not an ordinary image. It was Earth as seen from deep space, distant yet impossibly clear, as if viewed from outside the boundaries of the observable universe. Elias' blood ran cold. The entity was looking at it. It wasn't moving toward Earth in the way a fleet would. No engines, no propulsion, no visible movement. And yet it was closer now. It had shifted, covering distances that should have taken centuries in mere moments. Because distance did not apply to it. Because it did not travel in the way ships did. It simply was. Kel's breath hitched. She was staring at the monitor, her expression raw with horror. It's learning. Elias turned to her. What? She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. It doesn't move like us. It doesn't think like us. But it's curious. He stared at the screen again. At Earth, glowing faintly in the darkness. The realization hit him like a fist to the chest. The entity had never encountered humanity before. Not until they had called out to it. Not until they had sent the signal. And now. Now it was trying to understand them. It was peering into them. Studying them the way a scientist might study an insect beneath a microscope. A deep, bone-chilling dread settled over Elias. What would it do when it understood? A sudden, sharp noise made him flinch. A beep. The communications array had activated. But they hadn't touched it. Something was responding. Elias' heart pounded. The screen flickered, static washing over it before stabilizing. A voice came through. It was not human. Not alien. Not even alive. It was something else. A whisper that was not a whisper. A voice that did not use sound. "You have called." Elias' breath caught in his throat. "We are here." Cale let out a strangled gasp. "Elias, it's speaking to us." His mouth was dry. They were never supposed to hear this. They were never meant to receive an answer. But the entity had decided to respond. A sensation crawled over Elias' spine, like unseen fingers running along his nerves. He felt it again, the weight of its attention. It was waiting. Waiting for them to speak. Waiting to see what they would do next. Elias' mind raced. What could they say? What could they possibly do? And then a horrifying thought struck him. Had it already decided? Had it already judged them? The monitors shuddered, displaying something new. It was Earth. But now, it was burning. Elias could not breathe. His vision tunneled, his pulse hammering in his ears as he stared at the screen. Earth was burning. Not in the way a planet might when struck by asteroids or bombarded from orbit. Not like the shattered remains of Vesper 3. This was different. The flames weren't natural. They didn't consume like fire should. They spread in ways that defied physics, blotting out entire continents in an instant, erasing entire oceans like ink spilled across a page. The planet itself seemed to be unraveling. Not just destroyed, unmade. No, 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 no. Elias stumbled back from the monitor, his knees nearly buckling. His mind rebelled against the sight, refusing to accept it. "This isn't real," he whispered hoarsely. His throat was dry, his voice raw. "It can't be real." Cale didn't answer. She was shaking. Not with fear, but with something worse. With knowing. "They're showing us," she rasped. "Showing us what happens if they decide we're unworthy." The weight of her words crushed the air from Elias' lungs. He turned toward her, desperate. "Then we have to. We have to tell them. We have to stop this before." A flicker on the monitor. The image shifted. The flames vanished. Earth was whole again. Pristine. Untouched. As if it had never been harmed at all. Elias' breath caught. Cale inhaled sharply. The entity wasn't just displaying a possible future. It was giving them a choice. Judgment had not yet been passed. Not yet. And yet, the whisper returned, not in words, but in thought. "We observe." A pause. Then, "We decide." Elias clenched his fists. His head was spinning. He had no idea what to do, what to say. How did you plead for the survival of an entire species? How did you convince something beyond understanding that humanity deserved to exist? Cale was breathing heavily, her eyes darting over the screen. "It's a test," she muttered. "They don't understand us yet. They want to see how we respond." "How we respond to what?" Elias asked. Cale hesitated. "To them. To the knowledge that they could erase us in an instant." Elias' mind raced. A response. They needed a response. But what could they possibly say? Could they bargain? No, this entity did not deal in diplomacy. Could they threaten? No, nothing they had could even touch something like this. Then what? Elias' gaze darted to the console. The communications array was still active. A message could be sent. A single transmission. Humanity's last chance. His hands hovered over the controls, trembling. He could feel the pressure of the entity's awareness. Waiting. Watching. If they hesitated too long, would it decide for them? Cale swallowed hard. "We have to tell it the truth." Elias snapped his head toward her. "What truth?" She met his gaze, eyes raw with intensity. "That we are flawed. That we are not perfect, not enlightened, not without blood on our hands. But," she inhaled sharply, "we fight for something more. We struggle. We adapt. We create. We try to be more than we were yesterday." Her voice wavered. "And that's what makes us worth saving." Elias' breath hitched. It was a gamble. An appeal to something they could not comprehend. But What other choice did they have? He turned back to the console. His fingers clenched into a fist, then uncurled, hovering over the transmit key. He took a deep breath and pressed it. His voice was steady. "This is Commander Elias Voss of the Human Expeditionary Fleet." A pause. "You have seen us. You have touched our minds. You have learned what we are." Another breath. "And you know now that we are not perfect. We are flawed. We fight wars. We make mistakes. We reach too far, grasp too much, and sometimes we bring ruin upon ourselves." He swallowed hard, eyes locked on the shifting patterns on the screen. "But we are also something more. We are dreamers, builders, explorers. We search not just for survival, but for understanding." A pause. "If you must judge us, then judge us as we truly are. Not by our worst moments, but by what we strive to be." Silence. The longest, most agonizing silence Elias had ever experienced. The entity did not reply, but they felt it. A pressure, a weight, lifting. Kale let out a shaky breath. Then, the monitors flickered. The image of Earth changed. Not burning, not whole, but different. It was the same planet, but transformed. A vision of a future yet to be. Skies illuminated by lights that were not bombs, but cities. Oceans untouched by war, but teeming with life. A people not divided, but united in purpose. A future where humanity thrived. The whisper returned. Soft, almost. Amused. "We will see." The monitors cut to black. The bunker shook. A deep resonance hummed through the walls, the floor, the very fabric of reality itself. The weight of the entity's presence began to recede. Then, it was gone. The bunker fell silent. Elias' legs gave out. He collapsed into the chair, breath ragged, heart hammering. Kale wiped at her face with shaking hands. "Did we?" Elias exhaled, staring at the blank screen. He didn't know, but they were still here. For now. Kale let out a breathless laugh. "We sent a distress call." Elias gave a weak chuckle, and the universe answered. Neither of them spoke after that. There were no words for what had just happened, what they had survived. Elias stared up at the ceiling, his mind still reeling. Humanity had called out into the darkness, and something had listened. Something beyond them. Something that had seen the worst and the best of them, and chosen to wait. For now. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all.